Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's early morning on the East Coast. It's a little later in the day in the UK, but we've got a very special webinar. Little housekeeping, real quick. I'm gonna let everyone trickle in. If you can hear us, if you're already here, give us a shout out in the comments. My name is Garrett Sussman of iPullRank. We'll go through the introductions. We've got Mike King of iPullRank and Will Critchlow of Search Pilot. We'll let you know how awesome these dudes are, but just for the recording, letting everyone know who is coming in here that we are recording the session. We will send out the replay as soon as it's over. We're going to get you the deck with all of the delicious goodies that we've got planned for you today. Got a really big crowd, which I love. Already 50 in the house. Can you all let us know where's everybody calling in from? And Mike and Will, how are you guys doing today?
Well, we were just discussing the virtues of water.
You're gonna make me say it on stream, aren't you? I was just telling the Americans that I am incapable of saying water in a way that American servers can understand me. And water. I can't even do it in an American accent well enough that it gets understood. And my British accent goes to everything else totally fine. I can order everything else, but apparently not a glass of water.
I mean, the second way you say water is basically the way I say water, so I don't know why it doesn't work for you.
It doesn't work for me, Mike. It doesn't work.
I don't live up to expectations. I'm from Jersey originally, and so people expect me to say like water, like with that. But I don't have I'm from Central Jersey, which you don't know as well, but people claim that Central Jersey, the center of New Jersey, doesn't exist. Facts, it does. It's a real place. It's the Princeton, Trenton area. It is real.
I've heard of Princeton.
Yeah, you didn't hear it was from Jersey, though.
Actually, that's true.
Okay, we got Jennifer says, when in Boston, we say water. What I can't do a Boston accent. Wicked water.
Oh no.
Oh no.
I think maybe we should move on to the SEO.
I mean, it doesn't matter. The location doesn't matter in SEO, right?
Turns out it matters a lot.
Oh. Well, we will test that among many other things. We got a banging webinar today. For those of you who are under a rock, there was a little bit of a Google leak that happened. We'll dive into all of it. And so we're going to kind of, roller coaster through this ride. Got a lot of interesting insights and experiments and tests and all that. We'll discuss the difference between tests and experiments. So without further ado, we'll save a little time for Q&A in the end. Hey, we got Evo from UK, Lee's here, Jennifer. Let's dive in. Let's talk about this. Who are you?
Cool. I'm Mike King. I'm the founder and CEO of iPullRank, and I'm also one of the key people that help bring the leak to life for our community.
Yes, he's all about that leak life. Anyway, I'm Garrett Sussman. You can find me on the Twitters and the LinkedIns at Garrett Sussman. I do demand generation management here at iPullRank as well. Love myself some SEO, some marketing. Been doing it for a minute. And the third gentleman. Oh, before we dive into him, we are iPullRank. We are an agency. We do SEO, content strategy, generative AI. You name it. If it's about visibility, we can hook you up. We helped our clients earn over $4 billion with a capital B. So, if you want a little something of that, you know who to talk to. This guy right down here. And finally, from across the pond.
Hi, folks. Will Critchlow, founder and CEO at Search Pilot. And so I used to run an agency, but I'm out of that game now. So it's all about iPullRank. And thank you for having me on your show, fellas. I now run a company called Search Pilot. We specialize in SEO testing for very large websites. So you can see some of the folks that we work with there. You all know Marks and Spencer's in the US. This is iconic British brand that some folks do. Big retailer. Our newest logo on that screen. So that's pretty cool. But some, you definitely heard of Petco, right? And so yeah, some good folks on there. And yeah, we specialize in very large websites, e-commerce, travel, those kind of spaces, and SEO experimentation and testing. And that's why we're talking today.
But wait, hold on. I want to say something real quick because I just felt all the British humility that came through here. First of all, the things that Will just said, he really undersold it, right? Like Distilled, his previous agency, was one of the best SEO agencies in the space.
Thanks, Mike.
And Search Pilot, they really helped define what SEO A/B testing is. And what before them, there wasn't really SEO software for it. So you've got the expert or one of the experts from that team on this call. So thanks for being here, Will.
I appreciate it, Mike. And yeah, shout out to my team. We've been together a good chunk of us since the early agency days. And yeah, some of those folks you might know, Tom Anthony, CTO, Craig Bradford, COO, Emily Potter heads up our customer success team. Like these folks have been around for, we like to say, I don't think there is a team that has more SEO testing experience in the world now.
You're right.
And plus, to make the sports analogy, it's like when you think of like coaching trees, like the distilled coaching tree of everyone who's branched out and built their own thing as well. Like,
yeah,
you guys are, you're everywhere. Anyway, let's dive in. Mike, you want to set the scene for what the heck went down the last couple of months?
Yeah. So go to the next slide. We can talk about it. So a gentleman named Irfan Azimi reached out to Rand Fishkin and told him that he got some documentation from internal documentation that leaked about Google's algorithm. And Rand reached out to me and he was like, Mike, I need you to help me understand this, vet this. Let's figure out how we can bring this to the community. And, I tweeted about it really vaguely the night after I got it. I was like, yeah, I'm about to set the SEO internet on fire. And then Dan Petrovic from Dijon SEO out in Australia, he figured out what I was talking about because he also had a copy of this and he had it for a few weeks prior to that. So, he shared with me a lot of what he had done as far as like collating all the documents and relating them to other things. And then I combine that with all the research that I've been doing and also the experience that I have in this space. And then I just wrote up a pretty robust blog post, also worked with Rand on that too. He wrote a blog post and then we let that go. And the community, kind of went crazy just to be able to get a sense of what Google is actually reviewing. And the main thing I like to say about that is what that is the ingredients, not the recipe, right? Like we're not getting their scoring functions. We don't necessarily know what they do with every feature downstream in the quote unquote algorithm. But we now have a good sense of what it is that Google is actually looking at. And in a lot of cases, just validation for things that we thought in the past, but also things that we didn't think about in the SEO space. So as far as what we're looking at, there were 2,596 modules representing 14,014 attributes. And when I looked at this data, one of the things I did was I segmented it by the different services that it was related to. And about 8,000 of those attributes are related to search directly. So what that really means is that there's a lot of things that we can test. And again, a lot of these things are things that we have known about in our space, or at least thought we did for a long time. But now we have more direct information, like we should try this thing out to see how it impacts our visibility and rankings. So first, let's just talk a little bit about the mechanics of SEO testing and what that means. Well, first of all, I think that testing or SEO in general should always be experiment driven. And there's a variety of ways you can think about experiments. And Will's going to tell us a bit more about that in a second. But my whole point here is that, you should have a testing program in place, even if you're a small site. I think typically people think of testing is just for big sites, but I think there are also tests you can do for small sites as well. And you should continually be figuring out like where these edges are so you can determine like, okay, what works here for me and my site, not just like, how do I keep fulfilling these best practices?
So I think this is over to me. So as Michael just said, I fully endorse the all sites. Everyone should have that growth mindset, I guess. Stay curious is one of our values at Search Pilot. And that's what honestly has kept me engaged in the industry for almost 20 years now. And it's that fact that we can keep learning. My experience these days tends to be on those larger sites, and that's the angle I'm kind of coming from predominantly. But I do think you're right that even on the small sites, you've got to be hunting for those advantages all the time. I'm still partial to the days when we used to call it competitive webmastering, and that's a nice mindset, I think, to come at this stuff with. So SEO split testing in particular, this is what we specialize in at Search Pilot, and this really, you do need a site of a certain size. Our kind of rule of thumb is you probably need 1,000 organic sessions a day to the site section that you're running the test on, because what you're going to do is you're going to be randomizing the pages and making changes to some pages in the variant group and keeping some pages in a control group unchanged, and then running statistical analysis to figure out if the pages you've changed have outperformed what you would have expected given what you've seen in the control group. And by doing that, you're running a controlled experiment, which means that it takes account of all the extra factors, things like seasonality, site-wide changes, Google algorithm updates, what your competitors are doing, all those kinds of actions that can be can muddy the waters and make it difficult to run the kind of just change something and look before and after experiments. And so, especially on large websites, that's kind of where we're focusing on. We are today, though, going to talk a little bit about split tests, which is what I was just describing, and we're going to mention some tests that are what we call lab tests. So things you would run in a laboratory. And the example here is an old one from, you mentioned Rand already. Rand, getting a second shout out, he initiated an organization called IMEC Labs. I don't even remember what it stood for anymore. I'm sure the I was in there. But the idea was that a group of folks would get together to run these experiments. And this is not controlled typically, but it's able to look to see whether things have any impact at all. So this is when you're looking at things like, does the anchor text on an internal link change at all whether the recipient of that link can rank for that? And so you can test that with a made up keyword on a website with three pages, right? Like you can, these are the kind of tests that you run on your experiment sites. And what that tells you is that those kind of experiments give you directional information, but they don't typically quantify the impact. And so they're useful for some of the things, some of the lab leak stuff, some of the API leak stuff that we're going to be talking about. The only things you could do is run a lab test to say, is this a thing at all? Whereas what we're mainly going to be focusing on today is the things that we can run as split tests, because then we can say, is it worth it? Do you actually get measurable, quantifiable benefits? Where we then get into, and this is just off on a little tangent for a second, but I think it's important, is how you fit this all together. And in a small organization, it's about finding that edge wherever you can. In larger organizations, we talk a lot about building experimentation programs. And this is pretty common in large orgs, that you'd have this in some areas of the business already, right? In conversion rate testing and user experience, you're probably testing your paid media channels, these kind of things. We often get brought in to help add SEO into an existing center of excellence in an experimentation team. But it's really a key feature at enterprise level is, can that SEO team manage that process successfully? And can they run these tests as part of a structured program where you've got hypotheses for the ideas that you're putting together, you're learning, you're not just blindly rolling out winners. And crucially, this last point, that you can, once you're up and running, you can then measure and manage the program. So not just, is this test a good idea, but am I managing the program well? So are we running enough tests a quarter? Is our win rate holding up? Those kind of metrics. If you want more about that, we'll be sharing these slides. It's got some links to some more information.
Well, real quick, before we go any further, what is your recommendation for someone that's in an enterprise who wants to start doing this? Maybe they don't already have like a structured testing program on the conversion side that they can like extrapolate from. How would you recommend that they build the business case to get started?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways into this, and I think it depends how burning the need is in the organization. So sometimes we're brought into where there's a very, very burning need, and that typically is a business need. It's typically either there's been an underperformance, and I was speaking to a large brand last week that's down double-digit percentages year over year, and I was talking to the individual who's been brought in to turn that around, and they're saying, we're rolling out a number of initiatives. One of the initiatives we want to do is kick off a structured program of rapid testing. In that case, your boss is kind of bought into the pain, right? The boss understands the need to do something, and you're saying, this is not just something, this is the thing, or this is one of the things we should do. And in that case, it's about building the, I like to think of it as like building the engine. So what you really want from the channel is the ability to put more effort in and get more out, which has always been difficult in SEO. SEO has often been this kind of, you do what you can and you kind of hope and see what you get. Whereas what you've got when you've got an experimentation program in place is you can put more budget in, you can increase that testing cadence, and you can get more out the other end as long as you manage the whole program. So that's the case where there's burning pain. If there isn't burning pain, I would say start small. And I've actually got a post coming soon about the did you see that there was a great MozCon talk from Heather Physiok about the SEO maturity curve a couple of years ago?
Yeah.
A few years ago now. I think this was pre-pandemic. And so I've been working on something that's but for testing. So what's the SEO testing maturity curve? And the bottom level of that is basically running individual tests. So just get that buy-in to run one, or run, on some kind of strategically important thing, or even just in a test bed, a test case. And from that, you can build the business case that says, hey, if we rolled this out as a program, we can shoot for the stars. And there's the case slightly in between where it's not a burning pain, but there's more like an opportunity. So with some of the folks, the other big reason we get brought in is a big target, and forecast is like below target. So like you might be doing fine, but the boss wants more. And that's like, again, that question of, okay, how do we put more fuel into this and get more results out of it?
Gotcha. Yeah. So it's a lot about like you in the past, you talked a lot about like flywheels, and this is largely about like how you can use SEO to create a flywheel that's kind of like structured and measurable. I got one more question for you before we jump into the structure, how to structure these tests. What happens if the person starts with one test and then that test is a failure? Like, how do you recommend that they contextualize that to showcase it as a win?
I mean, it very much depends how you've set it up in advance. So sometimes you can get a proof of concept for this kind of thing running where the goal is to show that you can run a test. And the success criteria is just, hey, we ran a thing and we measured a thing. More often, though, you're right that you're looking for some kind of business outcomes. There's two different kinds of failure. So a negative test outcome, as in this was a measurable drop, is sometimes just as valuable as an uplift if this was a thing you were going to do. And I've talked about this a lot in terms of like the difference between a seatbelt and a safety net. So like you wear a seatbelt not intending to crash, right? But it's there for that kind of worst case scenario, and it can save you in those situations. And that's the kind of case where you get that negative test result where if you hadn't been testing, you would have rolled it out. And we've seen this with site redesigns that they were right on the verge of rolling out, but we're like, I remember one that was minus 18% in organic traffic. You're like, whoa, let's just pump the brakes here, fellas, and reassess this before we roll it out. In some cases, you can just sell the business on amount of learning, right? How quickly we're going to learn new things. But I think really you're trying to get that buy-in to say, look, if we knew which were going to be winners, we wouldn't have to run a testing program. Of course, there are going to be winners, losers, and inconclusive tests. The first one could be any of those things, and there's no guarantee that the first one's going to be a positive test. If you're buying into the idea that the program is going to be valuable, then yeah, of course, you have to run a few to get to that kind of number. Because incidentally, a good win rate is like 20%. So that you can't expect the first test to necessarily out the gates be a positive one. But you can maybe slightly stack the deck in your favor if you've got a favorite idea that you just wanted to get over the line. And sometimes that can be valuable just to quantify the benefit of an obviously good idea. That can be a good way of running your first test as well. And then it's going to be good, but you just get to get more evidence for the business.
Cool. So yeah, let's talk about structuring SEO tests. You want to take this one?
Yeah. So I mentioned hypotheses already. This is just it's a long fancy, is it Greek word? I don't know. I didn't get a classical education. It's either Greek or Latin. But this is just a long word for basically saying, why you're doing something. So you go into it with an idea that says, I believe if we do this thing, then for this reason, we're going to get a good outcome. And it's important that you start that way around rather than just kind of throwing stuff at the wall. So you have this idea, you have a reason why it might be a good one, and you've defined how you're going to evaluate it. So your evaluation criteria is how you're going to measure this. For us, typically, this is measured in some combination of traffic and conversions, and we can dive down that rabbit hole, but you can measure rankings and things as well. And you have a process. So you've decided how you're going to control what variables you're going to be measuring. You obviously need a plan to actually get it done. And that can be either within your SEO team if you've got embedded engineers, or obviously you're going to have to be working with product and engineering and those folks to implement the actual change. You're going to need a measurement plan. So, you've got your evaluation criteria and you know what you're evaluating against. So you're going to be wanting to report against that. And there's various different frameworks for doing this. But fundamentally, it's some form of statistical analysis to figure out how things are going. And then the analysis separate to the reporting is crucially tying it back to that story. So going all the way back to the hypothesis and saying, okay, here's the result. Given what we've seen, what do we think is going on here? And being able to have a story that you can take back to the business, because then you're learning lessons and you're not just, if it was negative, you've got an idea of how you're going to iterate and how that's going to change up your roadmap in future. If it was inconclusive, that might point you away from a whole area of things that you're saying, look, this doesn't seem to be all that sensitive. We're going to deploy our efforts in other places. And so there's a link here to a document, which is just a template that we use just to help us structure these thoughts. And folks might find that useful, so they can grab that. It's a Google Doc. Just take a copy of it and you can make it your own.
Yeah, absolutely. So on test duration, obviously from my perspective, it's always been about a data-driven way to look at this, right? Like, because, there's a lot of A/B testing solutions out there now. And unfortunately, from my perspective, no one until you guys were actually looking to see, like, were these pages being crawled in the time frame that these changes were rolled out. And so I think it's very valuable to validate that and get a sense of, like, how long does it take to get these pages recrawled, with the idea that hopefully they're being indexed, and then you can determine what the change is. But tell us a bit about, like, what you guys have landed on for best practices for test duration.
Yeah, so we've actually just been pulling some of these stats because I've mentioned with a testing program, one of the key things is how many tests you can run in any time period, your testing cadence. And obviously a key determinant of that is how long tests take to run, because they tie up a site section while they're running. And so basically the two variables are how many site sections can you split your site into to run simultaneous tests on, and how long does the test take to run. And we've been driving down that length of time for an average test over the last couple of years. And most recent data is about 3 weeks. That is slightly skewed short by the fact that occasionally you get a very strongly negative test that folks turn off straight away. Whereas with a positive test, we tend to say keep it running for a little longer just to capture the data and get the confidence. But nobody wants to do that with negative tests. So 3.5 weeks, that kind of length of time. But the Googlebot thing that you were mentioning is really interesting. So when you get a strong result, positive or negative, you can be pretty confident it has been recrawled, right? Like the result wouldn't show up otherwise, because you're controlling for everything else. I mean, hopefully there's asterisks in there, but broadly speaking, the statistical model can do the job of saying, are we good to go? Can we call this? And our model gets to that kind of, yes, we're happy to call this as a winner or a loser. Where it gets more interesting is the inconclusive tests, which is kind of saying, hey, look, all it can say is I haven't detected anything yet. I find myself saying that to the kids all the time. You talk to your kids about a growth mindset. Whenever they say, I can't do whatever, it's like, I can't do that yet. The statistical model needs a growth mindset. It's like, I have detected no uplift yet, but it can't tell you it's never going to. Right. And so that's where Googlebot data really shines, because if we can say, look, the whole thing has been recrawled, and typically the other thing we found is it's crawled faster than we expected. So most of the big sites that we're working with, 80% of the pages and 90-something% of all the sessions, as in the biggest pages, are recrawled within a few days, 3 or 4 days. And but when we've got that data, we're able to then say, look, the site section's been recrawled for days now. We're still seeing no impact. Let's move on. Let's move to the next test.
Gotcha.
I think this was more of the same thing.
Yeah, he's just like
keep going.
So we talked about the first thing. So I mentioned that a good rule of thumb is having 1,000 organic sessions a day to the site section in question. The more the better, though. Up to a reasonable point. With very large sites, we do tend to break these site sections down just so that we can get more tests through the door. But in general, you'll be able to detect smaller uplifts with greater confidence more quickly, the more traffic that the site section, the bigger the site section is. And the outlier piece, just very briefly, is sometimes controlling external factors doesn't take account of everything. And we've seen this with everything from things you can predict, like Mother's Day on a flower retailer website, to things you can't predict, like the page that sells masks on a pharmacy website mid-COVID. And sometimes you just have to say, look, that page is a wild outlier, and we're going to try and analyze the data without it. Here we're getting really into the meat, though. So as we try and test ideas that have come to us from the API docs leak that we're talking about today, we have to try and look at these ideas and insights that have come from them and ask ourselves, is it testable using one of these kind of methodologies? And to be testable using a split test methodology, it has to be falsifiable, right? So there has to be an observable effect that we believe we would get from making a specific change to the page. And it has to apply at the page level, because there's tons of stuff in the docs that apply at the site level. And those kind of things we might be able to run a lab test on, but we're not going to be able to run a split test on. So some example of testable ideas that we're going to get into: freshness signals, structured data, content quality, internal linking. Those kind of things are all page level signals potentially. But there are some like site classifiers, authority signals that apply to the whole website, external link-based stuff, some of the spam classifiers, those kind of things we might only be able to run lab tests rather than split test kind of true experimentation.
Absolutely. So let's jump into it. First one, we're talking about, content quality, freshness, things like that. But, one of the things that we saw was that Google is trying to attach a date to pages. Like, they are really trying it in a variety of ways, right? They have the syntactic date, which is like, okay, is it mentioned in the URL? Is it explicitly mentioned in the document title? Things like that. Semantic date, is it mentioned, like, can it be inherently mentioned in the way it's talking about something? So saying like 2 weeks ago, and then they have a published date or whatever, like they're comparing it in that way. So there's a variety of different ways that they're extracting dates from pages. And so the hypothesis here is that, if we were to replace the month and year in the title tag with updated daily, is that something that Google will use to, use as like a freshness signal to further give visibility to a page? And you guys ran a test like this. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is, I should say, this one actually predates the leak. So the hypothesis here was based on all those kind of similar things. But what we were looking to figure out was a combination of, the hypothesis could be it will rank better. It could be that searchers will find it more compelling and more attractive, because this is in the title. You can see the mocked up example here. And so yeah, we ran this test in a kind of split test, exactly the way that we described. And if we flip to the results, we can see what we learned, which was that this one was a substantial uplift, an 11% uplift in organic traffic to these particular pages. A couple of things I want to unpick here. One is title tags are a big deal. And I think that, they've always been my favorite, but they're a big deal because they're one of the very few page features that can affect both ranking and click-through rate. And that makes them like double powerful. And I think actually one of the kind of maybe surprising bits of emphasis in the docs is there's a lot of stuff that's very title specific, right? Like the title of a document is kind of special cased above many other things, which makes a ton of sense.
Sorry, that makes sense because, historically, like going back to web crawler, which was like the first, major search engine or whatever, all it did was index the page title. Like there was no full text of any of that. And, for a long time, I think it took until like Lycos for there to be like actual full text search. So it makes sense that has always been like such a prominent feature. And it is also like meant to be like a concise, description of the page. So again, it makes sense. But the fact that Google is using it so heavily, even at this point, just goes to show that like you've got to spend time on the page title and make it, valuable to the search engine.
Yeah, 100%. So it's kind of interesting, actually. So let's just stay on that one for a second, Garrett, because there's a couple other things I just wanted to pull out. So the you mentioned putting some time into it, Mike, and it's fascinating. I mean, the game of paid search is changing these days with machine learning and I'm no expert, but performance max and all this kind of stuff. Like Google will automatically write your adverts so that you spend more money with Google. I'm assuming, you think back to the days when we got into the game. A huge part of the job of paid search was writing the adverts, was writing the titles that would show up in the paid search ad. Huge part of the job, maybe even the majority of the job. And fascinating that's been like the thing you hand off to the junior SEO, right? And I'm guilty of this as well. And I mean, I actually went back to some old client deliverables that that I worked on over a decade ago, and we had recommendations like you should update these title tags, and then we just had this like vague so they have some keywords in them. It wasn't quite that bad, but like it wasn't like here's a whole set of well thought through title tags that we could test against one another, like we would think about it today. And I think there's tons of untapped potential here, because you think about how much effort it takes to move up in the rankings, and you could potentially double your click-through rate with a better title. So that's one
even
thing.
in the same position.
Exactly, 100% in the same position. And the kind of somewhat related point though is, I mentioned Performance Max. Google's doing a similar thing with organic search, right? They're rewriting the title tags sometimes, and we actually have a test that we might talk a little bit about that in more detail. But I think just zooming out, one thing that I would say is that doesn't let you off the hook. So far, what we've seen is what is in your title still matters. So yes, they might tweak it. Yes, they might move things around. Yes, they might even rewrite it, but you can still get upside from having better titles yourself. And the final point, to get away from the title stuff, which I've gone down a little rabbit hole on, is back to the freshness and date stuff. I was unsurprised to see how much emphasis there was on dates in the leak. I know this is, some folks have talked about this as one of the surprising aspects. I was unsurprised by this because this has consistently been a powerful test outcome for us. Everything around dates and freshness, whether it's in structured data, whether it's in titles, whether it's in page copy, all these kind of stuff, to the extent that actually I've been suspicious of it being a bit too powerful, and kind of we've advised some of our customers like, yes, this is you will get a tactical win, but you may be seen as abusing this, and you should absolutely make sure that it actually aligns with how fresh is this content. Is it really updated? How new is it? Because yes, you can get the tactical short-term sugar rush, but most businesses want something more sustainable than that.
Yeah, I remember there was a blog post on Moz, I'm gonna call it like 5-6 years ago, where someone was like, yeah, just update your dates and then your traffic pops, and like then everybody started doing it. So yeah, I agree with you. It's definitely been something that people have been aware of, people have abused in a variety of ways. But yeah, it's very clear that Google is using that signal in a variety of ways, whether it's, for crawl activity, for, query deserves freshness, things like that. So yeah, it's a really important signal that you should continue to test.
And just last point there is like something to think about is extenuating experiments to run or tests to run is like, to Mike's point about syntactic and semantic dates, of like being able to test the difference of the impact, like, just changing that syntactic date versus actually changing the way it appears throughout the entire content. And would that have a greater impact?
Yeah, I've got a hypothesis. One of the variables is called something like repeated dates. I forget the exact language, but my suspicion is that is very tied to the query deserves freshness, and it's that those kind of live blog style format stuff where you've got breaking news, and those rank incredibly well just during that time while the news is breaking, and I suspect that's kind of very closely tied together. Just as we move on, just before we do, I'm just going to see that we've got a question in the comments from James, who is asking about how tests interface with things like core updates and what happens with updates that can come along periodically, and whether 3 weeks is long enough when you might have an update cycle that's slower than that. I've actually written a post specifically on this point, which I'll have to tweet out later. It's too long to read out. I don't have it to hand, but if you Google something like core updates site searchpilot.com, you'll probably find it. But basically it piggybacked on some research done by, we mentioned our alumni, one of the Distilled alumni, Tom Capper, who is now at Moz, did some research into the impacts of core updates over time, a kind of longitudinal study. So sites that have seen up on one core update, down on the next one, up on the next one, those kinds of things. And what he actually found was fascinating was that there's a kind of randomness to it. So even if sites that have a kind of trend line upwards, almost every site had at least some impacts in the opposite direction. So if they've generally been negatively impacted, they had some core updates that were positive, and vice versa. If they're generally up, they had some negative impacts, but that there was a trend over time. And I think this fits in with our belief that what Google is kind of doing with the core updates is more of the same. And you see this in their messaging, which I don't always trust the words that kind of come out of the spokespeople's mouths, but nonetheless, they will say, look, we've told you what to do. It's all over here. And very rarely is a core update associated with any kind of change of direction. And my view is that it's them kind of like dialing in the things that were already supposed to be working a specific way. And so our general view is that if you tactically run these short tests that show winners, you're heading in the right direction. You're heading in the right direction of travel for what Google wants to reward. And as the core updates come along, that will just be amplified because those core updates tend to move in that continuous direction. Mike, I don't know if you've got any other perspectives on that or other thoughts.
I do, and it's not that I disagree with you. I think that there are some instances where when we are following what they say, and then even if you test it and it shows positive, you can roll it out and it could also be negative. So here's an example, right? We were working with a really large e-commerce marketplace site that had two page types that were exactly the same. One was on like a search path. The other were on like these product listing page paths, basically. And the pages were exactly the same. And we were like, okay, let's canonicalize, one version to the other. And everyone was real fearful here because it was like millions of pages that were representing like, potentially 50, 80 million, visits per month. And so we did the canonical test 3 times and it was positive every time. And then we rolled it out and it tanked. So, I think there's just, like we said, there's a lot of variables, a lot of moving parts, and you can't just like test it, roll it out and like not look at it again. You got to continually measure and make sure things are performing the way that you want. And I think that to the point of algorithm updates, we can see, we saw something perform really well and it was during a rollout of a core update. And then we see it roll out, we do it again and we might see positive impact, but then we roll it out again. And then there's another core update. There's a possibility that it wasn't necessarily the test. So I think it's just the sort of thing you got to keep watching it.
Yeah, I think we talk a bit later on about the need to kind of iterate and continue those testing as part of that program. But anyway, we should hammer through some more because we've got some bunch of examples we want to share with folks. Incidentally, I've tweeted out that core update link.
Cool.
So
you
take this one.
This one has to do with keyword usage and relevance as a function of salience, centrality, term frequency. And so, to boil this down, it's really like if we generate more content on pages, will it make the page perform better? And I know you guys have run a lot of tests around this, particularly in this instance, it was the AI generated content. And again, I know this is well before the leak came out, and it may not have been specific to, centrality, things like that. But again, the hypothesis is still like, if we get more content that's relevant on the page, does it yield impact? So can you tell us a little bit about this one?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one where we saw different impacts in different markets. You can see all the write-up. I'm not going to read out all the numbers, but the punchline is different impacts in different places, sometimes inconclusive, sometimes showing real results. And we've seen this as a wider theme with content updates generally, is they're one of the hardest to predict the impact of. And we've run experiments comparing human writers versus AI, human writers versus no content, AI versus no content, all these different kind of variations, or even some of the boilerplate content that you typically see in SEO_text divs still. And the impact of these things is very hard to predict. So this is definitely one that I think probably because that list of stuff that you mentioned, Mike, all those different features, the centrality, all these kind of complex IR, information retrieval variables and features, you can't approximate this with the human eye. You can't just look at this and go, oh, that looks pretty central. You know, and even if you could, as you said, this is the ingredients, not the recipe. We don't know how Google is combining all these things. So yeah, definitely some of the more surprising results have come out of these kinds of tests.
So can you tell us about this one where you guys removed the copy from the e-commerce pages?
Yeah, so this was relatively, if I remember correctly, this was a what seemed to be low quality, low value content. This is the classic. I think this was travel, but you know, it's a classic e-commerce case where, you know, you're on your product listing pages, your PLPs is called in the industry, and you scroll right to the bottom of the. I'm not going to pick on someone,
the
but
big paragraph. Yeah,
telling you this is what a white men's shirt is. And you're like, dude, there's like 150 photos of them, and also I know what a white men's shirt is. And we're like, do we really need this? Do we really need this like 150 words that's clearly boilerplate and clearly whatever? But in this particular case, it was a strong result showing a negative impact of removing that content. Now, I think we followed this one up by showing that we could get a bigger uplift by not only having the content, but improving it. Even low quality content was doing something directional. And so I think this is just a word of caution, even if stuff seems to be serving no purpose. I mean, this is the classic, what's the anecdote in kind of computer science? There's some famous engineer has some comment about basically how never remove a line of code until you know why it was put there in the first place. Because even though it's that kind of like dumb looking stuff, you're like, that could be load bearing. So this was a case where what seemed like low quality boilerplate type stuff was load bearing on some rankings.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all seen it so many times. Like, you know, we have a case study where we were using generative AI back in like 2020, and we combined GPT-2 output with like the data model on the page. Yeah. And it yielded like 5.4 million incremental visits and 300 million in incremental revenue. It's like, it's ridiculous that it works so well, but it works so well. So
yeah, it's a means to an end. I mean, that's why people put crap content on the web, is like, if it works, it works, which is frustrating.
I was just going to say, we should have the little disclaimer back here, like we were talking about with the freshness stuff. You can get tactical wins that don't last sometimes here as well. And I think this is an area where we've probably all seen the more recent folks. This has been done to death, I think, since some of those experiments that you're talking about, Mike. And so folks need to be a little careful around that.
Absolutely. I'm not saying do the SEO heist thing. You know, again, I think part of the benefit was that we stuck it to the data model. And so it was reasonably original content. Those pages actually still continue to perform. But yeah, I've seen a lot of pages come and go trying to do that tactic. So let's talk about a couple of things that we could run based on this leak. So, you know, one of the hypotheses that we have is based on this UGC discussion effort score, which to me sounds like Google is looking to, you know, determine, is this people like actually engaging in conversation here, trying to like benefit the page, or is it a bunch of like, you know, X rumor comments or whatever? And so the hypothesis here is if we were to obfuscate that content in some way, basically like, I don't want to call it cloaking, but make it so like, you know, Google can't see it for whatever reason, would that improve, you know, the rankings of the page, because the quality of the content, like the scoring measures around quality would go up. And so, you know, the way you could do this one would be either just removing it from a bunch of pages, or, you know, rendering it with JavaScript like after the document ready state, so then Google just doesn't see it. But also the user, it would be the same sort of experience for the user because it would take extra time to load. But nevertheless, the whole idea is that if we are to remove this, it may yield better performance. And then there's this one around the last significant update, which I think kind of goes with this idea of dates and so on. Because, you know, again, based on all the research I've been doing with respect to like all the patents and all that, I've learned a lot about how crawling actually works. And one of the things that they're doing is they're comparing versions of the page that they've seen before to determine like, how often are you actually updating? And so because Google's index effectively works kind of like the Wayback Machine, where they have versions of your page for a long time, they can compare like how significant that the updates are. And then they use that to determine what the cadence of crawling should be for that page. So the idea is if we can identify, what is that threshold for a significant update, we can use that to improve the crawl activity. And so, there's a variety of different ways we could do this test, right? Like it could be testing the length of the content, testing whether it's like a big block that we add, or is it pulling out a significant amount of content. I think this one is like, somewhat straightforward. It's really just like, how do we make an adjustment to the page that seems big enough that Google's like, oh, we need to crawl this more often. And, I think to some degree that could be, you could do it as a lab test if you're just doing it on like a handful of pages, or you could do it at scale if you're talking about like an e-commerce site where you're like, hey, why don't we just, update the description block substantially with language models on a regular basis, or remove the block where it's just like, here are all the attributes of the product or whatever. So there's just a variety of ways you could test that. Okay, so moving into these entity type content tests, we've got the product reviews. Garrett, why don't you tell us a little bit about this one?
Yeah, so it was interesting kind of looking at some of the e-commerce. There's a lot. If you start searching for shopping related features throughout the docs, still working on putting together like what all those are, because it's extensive. But obviously you see things related to price, related to reviews. I think, with the big, Merchant Center next version coming out, it's something we need to pay attention to more. So if you wanted to test, for instance, adding reviews to your page and the impact that has. I know that Will's team did a study about that where you had the pricing and then you added reviews on top of that in the variant to see what the impact would actually be. You want to talk about this one real quick?
Yeah, this is an interesting one because this one turned out to punchline being conclusive. And I think it's a really interesting case where we've talked about the complexity of Google and all of the different ways they combine the ingredients into their recipe. But this is, I think, an interesting one that's more on kind of human psychology of this stuff is showing up. So, star ratings, prices, number of reviews, these kind of things, but they interact in really complex ways with how likely is a human to click on this result. And I think one of the things that we've seen with e-com in particular is that, especially in some markets, competitor prices are not directly comparable, right? Bundle sizes can be different, delivery costs can be different, whatever it might be. And I think if I recall correctly, one of these ones was a case where bundles were different. So our stuff, our customer's website looked more expensive because they were selling in 50s instead of 10s. And that stuff can show up weirdly or can put searches off when they and so I think there's a kind of human psychology element to this, but you kind of need multiple steps in this kind of hypothesis. Is Google going to see it? Are they going to do anything differently? Is it going to show up in the search results? But then also, what do we think humans are going to do as a result? Because most structured data, in my experience, is a human impact. It doesn't tend to affect rankings. Mike, I don't know if you've seen different cases of that, but what we've typically seen is structured data has an impact when it changes the snippet and you get a better click-through rate, not because you rank for new stuff or rank better than you used to.
I agree. I think that in the generative AI context, there's more value there as far as like appearing, because large language models will ingest everything. And so we've been pushing people to mark up any relevant vocabularies. But to your point of ranking in core web search, absolutely. It's all about, the rich results that you get as a result of it.
Yeah, and just to tap on that, one thing I covered in my Moscon about the cognitive bias of these is that Google ran a study in 2020 where they tested things like reviews, authority, scarcity, like is there free shipping, things like that. And they tested a bunch of brands in the UK against imaginary brands. And a lot of times when you had these psychological factors, people actually chose the fictional brands over the actual real brands just based on those benefits. So it is absolutely, and I agree with Mike too, right? Recently, we just heard Google say that they're going to start testing ads in AI overview shopping queries. They kind of pulled back significantly on AI related shopping queries. So, leverages the Google graph significantly. That's something that any information we can provide, anything they're pulling, whether it's from forums, reviews, whatever, that's going to impact the results. And so as you mentioned, well, this one was inconclusive. Psychologically, it might have an impact. It's definitely worth continuing to test.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot to talk about as it relates to user engagement metrics. And I think historically in SEO, we've been like, no, Google doesn't use clicks and so on because they've told us they don't. And, we've also see here that that's patently false. There's a variety of different ways that they are measuring clicks. And in fact, I read in the Plex recently. You might be shocked that I never read that before, but there are whole pages where they're talking about, yeah, we use clicks and everything because it's the way that we determine if our results are good or not. So whole point here is that Nav Boost, which is the system that is leveraging clicks to either demote or, promote pages based on their performance, or even have pages remain in the position that they are, is effectively like a huge testing ground for both split testing and also CRO testing as well. And I know you guys have or correct me if I'm wrong, I think I read that Search Pilot can do both at this point together.
Yeah, so we run either or both, and when we put them together, we call it a full funnel test, which is combining the impact of the visibility and the conversion rate.
Yeah, and so to that end, like you said, the page title, the meta description, those are super valuable to driving the clicks. And then the user experience is how you keep users on the page. So when we think about these sorts of tests, again, it starts from, do we have a meta description that's driving click-through rate? And I know you guys have done tests in the past where you just removed it entirely. So why don't we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we hinted at this one earlier. This is one of my favorite tests because unpicking what had actually gone on here is really interesting. Because so what we did was we removed the meta description from some of the pages on the assumption that obviously Google would write something in the snippet. And would it write something that was more compelling than the meta description that we had? Punchline, yes. But what was really interesting was they looked terrible. So when you look at these snippets that Google had written, they were like badly formatted, not whole sentences. It was like a little bit of word salad, basically. But they had an advantage, an unfair advantage over us, which was that they could show a different snippet for different queries. And pages don't just rank for one query, right? Pages can rank for tons of queries. And the fact that they could put a different snippet for different queries when they were writing it meant that these things, yes, they weren't perfectly grammatical, but they did show the searcher that the thing they were searching for was somewhere on the page. And it was often bold as well. So ours were more compelling in that kind of for one query. But when you look at the whole set of queries that page ranked for, they managed to win out on the long tail because they were highlighting that, in fact, the thing the searcher was looking for was somewhere on the page, even if it wasn't perfectly grammatically correct. And so that was one of my favorites. We've retested this in other situations. It doesn't perfectly always hold true. So don't definitely take this as like, oh, I should just go delete my meta descriptions. Again, the moral of the story here is everyone needs to test this stuff, but it is a really interesting test.
Yeah, and oftentimes when we do our proposal for clients, we look at their performance for like non-branded terms versus branded terms in GSC. And whenever we see that the click-through rates are like way lower than the threshold of expectation, we will recommend like we need to test this right away. Like let's remove all your meta descriptions because you guys may be standing in your own way from what you're providing. And, I think we've also seen studies where it's like 80% of meta descriptions don't get used anyway. So we always recommend testing it to see if that's something that we want to continue to put effort into. So, excuse me, with the page titles, again, the more successful clicks we've seen in a variety of ways can improve rankings, but now we know this is directly a function of Nav Boost. And so you guys have done some tests where you have added the brand to the page title to see if that has an impact. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, we've run this in a variety of situations. This tends to work best on the really well-known brands. And we've had different tests. This one shows a pipe. We've actually seen, I remember a recent one that was actually moving from pipe to saying like at brand or from brand. I forget the exact language. But this has, it's title tags again, my favorite HTML attribute. It has often been powerful, and playing around with this has been interesting. And I think, if I remember correctly, this is a really also interesting example, of the fact that this was there was strong indication that this was an uplift without it reaching statistical significance. And I have just enough of a statistical background to be dangerous. I did study statistics, but that was quite some time ago now. But we have a philosophy at SearchPilot. I call it, we're doing business, not science. If you are trying to release a new heart drug, you need to be to the, as many decimal places as you can, highly confident in the impact you're going to have, the potential negative impacts, and really quantify that kind of perfectly. When you're doing business, it's like that old joke. Your job is just to outrun the bear. You need to outrun your competitors. And so a lot of it is there's benefit to moving fast. And there is a downside in trying to get to 95, 99% confidence on many things. So on something like this, our advice would often be ship it, even if it hasn't reached statistical significance. And that will upset some statisticians. As I say, I have just enough background to argue with them and say, in this situation, given a customer's goals is growth and they're trying to outrun their competitors, there's very small chance this is a bad idea. Worst case, it's neutral. Let's ship it. Let's move on to the next thing.
Okay. And we're rocking and rolling. I know we're almost at time, so thank you for everyone who's sticking with us. We're going to go over a little bit, but remember, this is all being recorded. So if you do have to jump, we'll send the replay over as soon as this is done. So let's get through some of these tests you can run based on the week.
Yeah, so this one, again, goes back to this idea of page titles. When I look through, I didn't see anything to indicate like there is a hard max for titles. What they're looking at is they're doing token count. So really what that's saying is they're counting the number of words. But again, there's nothing to indicate that like there's only a certain amount of words that can be used. And also one of the things that some of the Google spokespeople have said is that the 60, 70 character thing is made up by SEOs. And effectively, they will look at things beyond the 60 and 70 characters. So, there's a variety of tests you can run. You can do ones where the page title is shorter. You can do ones where it's longer. And I know you guys have done one in the past where the page title is shorter. So let's jump to that one.
Yeah, this particular one was just the benefits of trying to be more compelling with a shorter, punchier, to the point title. This particular one was a winning test. But what's interesting is we've also seen the inverse of this, because sometimes when you try and shorten that title, you end up cutting off some of the long tail of other things that you were hoping to. This is typically this is good for the head keywords and negative for the long tail, or potentially cutting off some of that long tail. And I remember a really old case of it might have even been Brent Payne talking back in the Chicago Tribune days, but certainly someone in news SEO talking about the power of super long titles, and stuff can get indexed way past what is displayed. Yeah. Anyway, that's a little rabbit hole.
Yeah, that next slide is exactly that. Exactly that. So this is a test that we've run a number of times with our clients, and Pinterest was the first ones that we saw doing this, where they effectively are like appending a series of different keywords that they want to rank for. And as you'll notice here, when I had searched for this page, and it's all like, top 3, top 5 for all these keywords, it's ranking for keywords that don't get displayed in the SERP. So again, it just goes to show that you don't have to stick to that 60, 70 character window. And also in some cases, we'll see that when Google rewrites the page title, it's going to use components that aren't being shown currently on the screen.
Just like the meta description case, they can show different things for different queries, which is an unfair advantage. Yeah,
absolutely. So again, with Nav Boost, the whole idea is that the long click, the click where the user either doesn't come back to Google, or when they do come back to Google, they're not like clicking on another result, or they're not reformulating their query and then clicking on a different result and so on. So the whole idea is that the user experience can influence this. And I think this is why Google got so mad when Dan Petrovic did that test where he hijacked the back button and then sent the user to a fake version of Google, because it kills the signal for them. Like, they don't know that you come back because it looks like, you just never went back to Google. So to that end, my general hypothesis around UX is like, how do we get the user to the information they're looking for as fast as possible? And one of the ways to do that is adding the floating table of contents. And again, this is a test that I recommend that people try. Like, I don't have a result to show you here, but specifically, if you're like a recipe site or something like that, no one wants to hear your grandma's life story about how she learned to make apple pie. Like they want to get directly to that recipe. So give them the ability to go right there. And Google is doing that themselves, where they have those scroll to text links where they're dropping you directly on that chunk of content that you might be looking for. So in this case, again, it could be just testing an element like this and then measuring things like time on page, bounce rate, things of that nature, and then comparing that to ranking increases and or ranking stability. But we are actually in the process of working on a study with SimilarWeb where we're collecting, a lot of successful session data, right? Like users that go from Google, click on a result and stay on a page for 5, 6, 10 minutes, whatever it is. And so we're teasing out what are the commonalities from a UX perspective that you need to be thinking about. So I just want us to real quick jump to talking about how do we actually stand up this effective program, where we talk about, keep going, where we talk about the, what you should be doing now. So this next slide where we're talking about how we walk through actually making this something that works. And Will, like I said, no one has more experience than you and your team. So why don't you take us through this and how brands can be effective in getting testing working?
Yeah, so this is particularly once we're into the middle of that maturity curve, right? So you've been able to run some tests, and you're trying to go from running some tests to having an experimentation program. And this is about, in our view, having some goals for the program, but crucially measuring the bits you can control. And as I say, typically that's about driving test cadence. And this is where most of them fall down, in my experience. Most kind of folks who want to be better at running an experimentation program are lacking in how many tests they can run per month, per quarter. And there's a lot that goes into that, right? You need your ideas, your ideation backlog, your hypotheses. You need a workflow that can take them, some kind of project management around that. You need some kind of funnel of these ideas, which are the good ones, which are the bad ones, how are you going to prioritize? You need to have your engineering resource on point. They need to be able to build these things to launch on the cadence, because any downtime is wasted dead time. When you finish the test, you need to have the next test ready to go. If you don't, you can't get that time back. You can't bottle that time. So really driving test cadence is the key, because I mentioned that 20% number earlier, of how many tests turn out to be winners. That ranges 10. We see numbers ranging from 10 to 20% is pretty kind of standard. And that happens to be across all kinds of web experimentation. So you'll see similar numbers around winning conversion rate tests as well. There's a great HBR article that I think was based on data from Microsoft and a few other folks that talks about similar numbers in that 10, 15, 20% range. Point being, you shouldn't be dropping too far below 10%, but you're going to struggle to go much above 20%. And even I think our very best testing program is still in the high 20s. And so you can't get tons more winning tests by getting twice as many winners as anyone else. If you want twice as many winners, you have to run twice as many tests. And so testing cadence is that kind of crucial thing. And then you need to tie it to the business. And you asked this question earlier, Mike, about how do you make this work in an organization, especially in an enterprise? And the answer is you got to speak the language of the business. I talked the other day about how money is businesses' love language, and they spend money on things that they want to happen, and they understand that you care about them because you're giving them money. So report in the business's love language.
Cool. Garrett, let's take it home.
Yeah, I mean, there we go. There's so much stuff that came away from this. Mike, what are your big takeaways?
My big takeaways really are just how you can stand up a testing program. I think that, again, it doesn't need to always be huge enterprise level. I think like Will was saying, start somewhere, start with a single test, grow it as you need. But also, if you are in a large enterprise, there's probably something you can already tap into. There may already be a culture of testing. And so when you bring SEO as a testable idea where you can, get to a point where you have somewhat of a prediction of what the impact will be on different projects you want to do, the enterprise wants to hear that, right? Because it by itself, as a standalone practice, you can't really tell what's going to happen. So being able to have data on something before you roll it out at scale, and also so you have an understanding of what the risks are, is going to go a really long way in these big organizations. But beyond that, again, I think there's just a lot of hypotheses that we can develop based on this. And there was a lot of things we didn't get to, you know, especially as it relates to lab tests. I think there's a lot of things that we can try. But yeah, I think, you know, one of the things that I've seen the Search Pilot team talk about is having bold hypotheses. And again, I think by leveraging all the information from this leak, you have a lot more opportunity to come up with those bold ideas. So that's what I want to see people do more of.
How about you, Will?
Yeah, well, I just want to say mainly thank you. So thank you to both of you for having me on your show, but also more in bigger picture, thank you for all the work you've done unpicking this this leak. I think the work, you know, there are thousands and thousands of these things. I've tried my best to dig into it, but you've got a lot deeper than I have. And it's been great to see the creativity and boldness that comes with some of those ideas. And I think I would just encourage folks to do their own digging, but that's partly me geeking out. Really what they should be doing is building on the standing on the shoulders of giants, because you folks have done a ton of this thinking and heavy lifting for the industry. So thank you for that.
Thanks for saying that.
Dude, that's awesome. I mean, thank you everyone for joining us today. There are so many good ideas. And just speaking to Mike's point and Will's point, to like why you should hire an organization like Will or like ours, is that there's so much context, industries, business size, specific business problems. Like, to have a custom program set up for you is invaluable, because it's what you're going through as a business, you know, deeply. Combining that with the expertise of a team like Will's, and then putting the processes in place, I think is what's going to ultimately set apart organizations over the next 2, 5, 10 years, because things are only going to get more challenging. So, and I think the people who are able to really do some critical thinking and strategizing are the people who are going to succeed in SEO and content. So that said, we'll send over the deck. We'll send over the replay. Thank you all for joining us, taking your time on this lovely Tuesday. I can't believe we're at the end of July. How the hell did that happen? My name is Garrett with Mike and Will of iPullRank and Search Pilot. We will catch you at a future webinar. We got to do this again, right?
Cool. For sure. Take it easy, fellas.